The iron shackles bit deep into her wrists as Evelyn Roberts stood on the auction block, her swollen belly a testament to the life growing within her, despite the nightmare that had become her existence. The mountain wind whipped through the makeshift settlement, carrying with it the harsh voices of men who saw her not as a human being, but as property to be bought and sold. Her dark hair hung in tangled strands around her face, and her once fine dress was now torn and stained from weeks of captivity. The auctioneer's voice boomed across the crowd, describing her condition as if she were livestock, and she closed her eyes against the humiliation, trying to find some inner strength to endure whatever came next. From the back of the crowd, a tall figure emerged from the shadows between the rough-hewn buildings. Noah Watson had been watching the proceedings with growing disgust, his weathered hands clenched into fists at his sides. He had come to town for supplies, not expecting to witness something that turned his stomach and ignited a fire in his chest he hadn't felt in years. The mountain man's presence commanded attention even in his silence, his broad shoulders and imposing height making other men step aside as he moved through the crowd. His steel-gray eyes fixed on the woman on the platform, and he saw beyond her current state to the dignity that remained unbroken despite everything she had endured. The bidding had reached a fever pitch, with several rough-looking men shouting out increasingly higher amounts. Evelyn forced herself to look at their faces, memorizing each one, telling herself that no matter what happened, she would survive this. She had to survive this, for the child she carried and for herself. The baby moved within her as if sensing her distress, and she placed her bound hands protectively over her stomach, whispering a silent promise that she would find a way to keep them both safe. Noah's jaw tightened as he listened to the crude comments being shouted by the bidders, their intentions clear and revolting. He had lived alone in the mountains for the better part of a decade, avoiding the complications and cruelties of civilization, but something about this moment demanded action. He couldn't walk away and leave this woman to whatever fate awaited her. Without fully understanding why, he found himself stepping forward, his voice cutting through the noise like a blade through silk. The sound of his bid silenced the crowd momentarily. The amount he offered significantly higher than anything that had been called out before. Evelyn's eyes snapped to his face, searching for some clue about this stranger who had just potentially changed her fate. She saw intelligence in his gaze and something else that made her heart skip despite her circumstances. There was no cruelty there, no predatory gleam that she had seen in the other men's faces. Instead, she glimpsed something that looked almost like compassion, though she hardly dared to hope. The auctioneer called for any higher bids, but the crowd had grown quiet, intimidated by Noah's presence and the finality in his voice. When no other offers came, the gavel fell with a sound that seemed to echo off the surrounding mountains. Evelyn felt her knees nearly give way as the reality of what had just happened sank in. She had been sold, but to whom and for what purpose remained terrifyingly unclear. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in the comments. Noah approached the platform with measured steps, his expression unreadable as he counted out the money and handed it to the auctioneer. The man's greedy smile made Noah's skin crawl, but he completed the transaction without comment. When he finally looked up at Evelyn, she was studying his face with a mixture of fear and desperate hope. He could see the exhaustion in her posture, the way she swayed slightly on her feet, and he knew that whatever had brought her to this moment had been a long and difficult journey. The chains that bound her wrists were heavy and cruel, designed more for humiliation than security. Noah's eyes darkened as he examined the metal links, noting the raw wounds they had left on her skin. Without a word, he reached into his coat and withdrew a set of tools, working quickly and efficiently to pick the locks that held the shackles in place. The crowd watched in stunned silence as the chains fell away, clattering to the wooden platform with a sound that seemed to symbolize the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. Evelyn gasped as the weight lifted from her wrists, her hands automatically moving to rub the tender skin where the metal had chafed. She looked up at Noah with wonder, unable to speak past the emotion that threatened to overwhelm her. In all the weeks since her capture, no one had shown her even the smallest kindness, and this simple act of removing her bonds felt like a miracle. Noah extended his hand to help her down from the platform, his touch gentle despite the calluses that spoke of years of hard work. When she stumbled slightly, he steadied her with a firm grip on her elbow, his other hand instinctively moving to support her back. The protective gesture was unconscious, born of an innate decency that the harsh mountain life hadn't been able to erode. The walk to his horse was conducted in silence, with Noah keeping pace with Evelyn's slower steps and positioning himself between her and the crowd of onlookers who continued to stare and mutter among themselves. She could feel their eyes on her, could hear the speculation and crude comments, but somehow Noah's presence made it bearable. There was something solid and reassuring about him, like a mountain peak that remained unchanged regardless of the storms that raged around it. His horse was a sturdy bay gelding, well cared for and calm despite the commotion in the settlement. Noah helped Evelyn mount, his hands careful and respectful as he assisted her into the saddle. She had ridden before, in what felt like another lifetime, but her condition and weakened state made the simple act more challenging than it once had been. Noah seemed to understand without being told, adjusting the stirrups and checking that she was secure before swinging up behind her. The ride out of town was tense, with Noah's attention divided between the rough trail ahead and the potential for pursuit from behind. He could feel Evelyn's exhaustion in the way she leaned against him, her body finally allowing itself to relax now that she was away from immediate danger. The warmth of her against his chest stirred something in him that he had thought long buried, a protective instinct that went beyond simple human decency. As they climbed higher into the mountains, the settlement fell away behind them, becoming nothing more than a smudge of smoke against the valley floor. The air grew thinner and cleaner, carrying the scent of pine and snow from the peaks above. Evelyn breathed deeply for the first time in weeks, feeling as though she could finally fill her lungs completely. The baby seemed to settle as well, the constant movement easing as they put distance between themselves and the horror of the auction block. Noah's cabin came into view as they crested a ridge, a solid structure built of logs and stone that seemed to grow out of the mountainside itself. It was larger than Evelyn had expected, with a wide porch and windows that caught the afternoon light. Smoke rose from the chimney, suggesting that Noah had banked the fire before leaving that morning, never expecting to return with a companion. He helped her down from the horse with the same careful attention he had shown throughout their journey, his hands strong and steady as she found her footing on the uneven ground. Evelyn's legs shook with fatigue, and she had to grip his arm for support as the reality of her situation began to sink in. She was free from the auction block, but she was also alone with a stranger in a place so remote that screaming would bring no help. Noah seemed to sense her sudden tension, and he stepped back immediately, giving her space while remaining close enough to catch her if she fell. His voice, when he finally spoke, was deep and quiet, with an accent that spoke of education beneath the mountain drawl. 3 months earlier, Evelyn Roberts had been living a completely different life in the growing town of Millbrook, where her husband Anthony Scott ran a successful mercantile business. She had been happy then, excited about the pregnancy, and looking forward to starting their family in the comfortable home they had built together. Anthony was a good man, kind and gentle, who treated her with respect and love. Their marriage had been one of genuine affection rather than mere convenience, and Evelyn had considered herself fortunate to have found such a partner. The trouble began when Anthony's business partner, Gregory Flores, started making increasingly aggressive demands about expanding their operations into more questionable ventures. Gregory had always been the more ambitious of the two men, but his schemes had grown darker and more dangerous as the months passed. When Anthony refused to participate in what amounted to swindling their customers, Gregory's true nature began to emerge. The arguments between the two men became more frequent and heated, with Gregory accusing Anthony of being weak and lacking vision. Evelyn watched her husband struggle with the situation, torn between loyalty to his longtime partner and his own moral compass. She tried to support him as best she could, but she could see the stress taking its toll on Anthony's health and their relationship. The breaking point came when Gregory attempted to forge Anthony's signature on documents that would have transferred ownership of several properties to himself. When Anthony discovered the deception, he confronted his partner in front of several witnesses, threatening to expose Gregory's criminal activities to the authorities. It was a brave stand, but it proved to be a fatal mistake. That night, Anthony never came home from the store. When Evelyn went looking for him, the next morning, she found the building burned to the ground with her husband's body inside. The sheriff, who Evelyn later learned was in Gregory's pocket, ruled it an accidental fire caused by a knocked-over lamp. No investigation was conducted, and no questions were asked about the suspicious timing or Gregory's convenient absence from town that evening. Evelyn's grief was overwhelming, but it was compounded by the swift and brutal way that Gregory moved to claim everything that had belonged to Anthony. Using forged documents and the sheriff's cooperation, he seized the business, their home, and all of their assets, leaving Evelyn with nothing but the clothes on her back and the child growing in her womb. When she tried to contest Gregory's actions, she found herself facing a wall of corruption and indifference. The few honest citizens who might have helped her were intimidated into silence, while those in positions of authority had been bought or threatened into cooperation. Evelyn realized with growing horror that she was completely alone and powerless against Gregory's machinations. The final blow came when Gregory arranged for her to be arrested on false charges of theft, claiming that she had stolen money from the business before Anthony's death. The trial was a sham, with paid witnesses providing perjured testimony and a judge who had clearly been instructed on what verdict to reach. Evelyn was sentenced to indentured servitude, supposedly to work off the debt she had allegedly incurred. But Gregory's plans for her were far more sinister than simple labor. Instead of sending her to work for a respectable family, he sold her contract to a group of men who specialized in human trafficking. They transported her hundreds of miles into the remote mountain territories where law enforcement was scarce and questions were rarely asked about the origins of the people being bought and sold. The journey was a nightmare of fear and degradation, with Evelyn and several other unfortunate souls crammed into a wagon like cargo. She was the only pregnant woman in the group, which made her particularly valuable to the traffickers, but also subjected her to special attention that she desperately wished to avoid. The men who guarded them made it clear that resistance would be met with violence, and Evelyn learned to keep her head down and her mouth shut if she wanted to survive. The mountain settlement where they finally stopped was a lawless place, populated by men who had fled civilization for various reasons and who lived by their own brutal code. Women were scarce and treated as commodities, to be bought, sold, and used according to the whims of whoever held their contracts. Evelyn spent weeks in a cramped cabin with the other captives, watching as one by one they were sold to buyers whose intentions were rarely benevolent. The waiting was almost worse than the auction itself. Evelyn had time to think about what might happen to her, to imagine the various fates that could await her depending on who placed the winning bid. She tried to prepare herself mentally for the worst possibilities while clinging to the desperate hope that somehow someone might show her mercy. She thought often of Anthony during those dark weeks, remembering their conversations about the future and the family they had planned to build together. He had been so excited about becoming a father, spending hours discussing names and making plans for their child's education and upbringing. The memory of his gentle hands on her growing belly brought both comfort and unbearable sadness. The other captives tried to support each other as best they could, but the constant fear and uncertainty made genuine friendship difficult. They were all too aware that any of them could be taken away at any moment, and that forming attachments would only make the inevitable separations more painful. Still, there was a quiet solidarity among them, a shared understanding of their situation that needed no words. Evelyn's pregnancy progressed despite the poor conditions and inadequate food. She felt the baby's movements growing stronger each day, a reminder that life continued even in the darkest circumstances. She promised her unborn child that she would find a way to give them a better future, though she had no idea how such a promise could be kept. The day of the auction arrived with little warning. The captives were given rough clothing to wear and told to make themselves presentable for the buyers. Evelyn's heart pounded as she was led to the platform, the reality of her situation hitting her with full force. She was about to be sold like an animal, her future determined by whoever was willing to pay the highest price. Standing on that platform, feeling the eyes of the crowd upon her, Evelyn experienced a moment of complete despair. Everything she had once been, everything she had hoped to become, seemed to have been stripped away. She was no longer Anthony Scott's beloved wife or the expectant mother planning for her child's future. She was simply a commodity, valued only for what use she might provide to her eventual owner. But even in that moment of darkness, something inside her refused to break completely. Perhaps it was the life growing within her, or perhaps it was simply the stubborn strength that had carried her through all the previous trials. Whatever the source, Evelyn found herself standing straighter, lifting her chin despite the chains that bound her wrists. She would not give these men the satisfaction of seeing her completely defeated. The bidding began, and Evelyn forced herself to listen to the amounts being called out, trying to gauge what kind of future each bid might represent. The lower bids came from men who looked like they wanted cheap labor, while the higher ones suggested more personal and disturbing intentions. She prayed silently for deliverance, though she had begun to doubt whether any divine power was listening to her pleas. Then Noah Watson stepped forward, and everything changed. His bid silenced the crowd not just because of the amount, but because of the authority in his voice and the way other men instinctively moved aside to let him pass. Evelyn saw something in his eyes that she hadn't seen in weeks, a recognition of her humanity that the other bidders had completely lacked. When the gavel fell and she realized she had been sold to this stranger, Evelyn felt a complex mixture of relief and apprehension. Relief because he seemed different from the other men, less predatory and more controlled. Apprehension because she still had no idea what he intended to do with her, and her experience had taught her to trust no one completely. The moment when Noah removed her chains was one she would remember for the rest of her life. The simple act of freeing her from those bonds was the first kindness she had experienced in months, and it broke through the emotional walls she had built around herself. For the first time since Anthony's death, she allowed herself to hope that perhaps her situation might improve. Now, standing outside Noah's cabin in the thin mountain air, Evelyn struggled to process the dramatic change in her circumstances. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the wind through the pine trees and the distant call of a hawk circling overhead. Noah seemed to be waiting for her to speak first, his patient stillness both comforting and unnerving. Finally, Evelyn found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "Why did you do it? Why did you buy me?" Noah's gray eyes studied her face for a long moment before he answered. "Because leaving you there wasn't an option I could live with." His words were simple, but they carried a weight of conviction that made her believe he was telling the truth. "What do you want from me?" The question held all of her fears and hopes, everything she needed to know about her future compressed into those 6 words. "Nothing you're not willing to give," Noah replied, and again his directness surprised her. "You're free to leave whenever you choose. I'll give you supplies and directions to the nearest town if that's what you want. But you're also welcome to stay until you figure out what comes next." Evelyn stared at him in disbelief. In her experience, men who paid money for something expected to receive value in return, and the amount Noah had bid could have bought him a small farm. The idea that he might expect nothing in return seemed impossible, yet his manner suggested he was serious. "I don't understand," she said, her hand unconsciously moving to her swollen belly. "You paid a fortune for me. Surely you expect something." Noah's expression softened slightly, and for the first time since she had seen him in the crowd, he looked almost vulnerable. "I expect you to heal. I expect you to rest and eat proper food and remember what it feels like to be safe. Beyond that, we'll see what happens." The simple humanity of his words broke through the last of her defenses, and tears began to flow down her cheeks. She had been holding back her emotions for so long that their release was both painful and cathartic. Noah didn't try to comfort her or tell her to stop crying. He simply waited, giving her the space to feel everything she had been suppressing. When the tears finally subsided, Evelyn wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and looked around at the mountain landscape that surrounded them. The beauty of the place struck her for the first time, the way the afternoon light painted the peaks in shades of gold and purple, the clean smell of the air, the profound quiet that was so different from the noise and chaos of the settlement below. "It's beautiful here," she said, surprised by the observation. She hadn't noticed beauty in anything for months. "It is," Noah agreed, following her gaze to the distant mountains. "It's harsh sometimes, especially in winter, but it's honest. The mountain doesn't lie to you or pretend to be something it's not." There was something in his tone that suggested he was speaking from personal experience, that he had come to these mountains seeking the same honesty he described. Evelyn wondered what had driven him to this isolated place, what he was running from or searching for in the wilderness. Noah gestured toward the cabin. You should get inside and rest. You've had a long day and you need to take care of yourself. He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. There's a spare room that's clean and comfortable. You'll have privacy and space to think. The offer of privacy was another surprise. Evelyn had expected to be treated as property, used according to her owner's whims. Instead, Noah was offering her the one thing she had been denied for months, the right to control her own space and time. Inside the cabin, Evelyn was struck by the care that had gone into its construction and maintenance. The furniture was simple but well made, the floors were clean, and everything had its place. It was clearly the home of a man who took pride in his surroundings and who valued order and comfort. Books lined shelves along one wall, suggesting an educated mind behind the mountain man exterior. The spare room Noah showed her was small but welcoming, with a comfortable bed covered in clean quilts and a window that looked out toward the western peaks. A washstand with fresh water and clean towels sat in one corner, and Evelyn realized with a start that she would be able to bathe properly for the first time in weeks. There's soap and clean clothes in the chest, Noah said, indicating a wooden trunk at the foot of the bed. They belonged to my sister. She was about your size before. He trailed off, leaving the sentence unfinished. But Evelyn caught the note of sadness in his voice. After Noah left her alone, Evelyn sank onto the bed and tried to process everything that had happened. The softness of the mattress and the cleanliness of the room felt almost surreal after the harsh conditions she had endured. She ran her hands over the quilt, marveling at the intricate stitching and the obvious care that had gone into its creation. The mention of Noah's sister intrigued her. The past tense he had used suggested that something had happened to her, and the sadness in his voice indicated that whatever it was had been painful. Perhaps that explained his compassion, his willingness to help a stranger in desperate circumstances. Maybe he understood loss and suffering in a way that made him unable to ignore it in others. The baby moved within her, a strong kick that made her gasp and place both hands on her belly. The child seemed more active now that they were in a safer place, as if somehow sensing the change in their circumstances. Evelyn whispered to her unborn baby, telling them about the beautiful mountains and the kind stranger who had given them shelter. The water in the wash basin was warm, suggesting that Noah had heated it before bringing her to the room. The thoughtfulness of the gesture moved her almost to tears again. She bathed carefully, washing away weeks of grime and fear, feeling more human with each passing minute. The clean clothes fit reasonably well, though they had to be adjusted to accommodate her pregnancy. When she emerged from the room, she found Noah in the main area of the cabin, tending to a pot that simmered over the fire. The smell of cooking food made her stomach clench with hunger, reminding her that she hadn't eaten a proper meal in days. He looked up as she approached, and she saw approval in his eyes at her improved appearance. "Feeling better?" he asked, stirring the contents of the pot with a wooden spoon. "Much better, thank you." Evelyn's voice was stronger now, more like the confident woman she had once been. "The clothes fit well. Your sister had good taste." A shadow crossed Noah's face at the mention of his sister, but he nodded politely. Laura always did have an eye for quality. She made most of those dresses herself. He ladled stew into 2 bowls, the rich aroma making Evelyn's mouth water. "She would have liked you, I think." They ate in comfortable silence, with Evelyn savoring every bite of the hearty stew. It was the first truly nourishing meal she had eaten in weeks, and she could feel her body responding gratefully to the sustenance. Noah ate with the efficient manner of a man accustomed to solitude, but he kept glancing at her to make sure she was eating enough. As the evening progressed, they began to talk more freely. Noah told her about his life in the mountains, how he had come there 5 years earlier, seeking solitude and peace. He was vague about his reasons for leaving civilization, but Evelyn sensed that he, like her, had experienced loss and betrayal. His sister Laura had joined him 2 years later, fleeing an abusive marriage, and they had lived together harmoniously until her death from pneumonia the previous winter. Evelyn found herself sharing more of her own story than she had intended. There was something about Noah's quiet attention that made her feel safe enough to speak about Anthony's death and Gregory's betrayal. She told him about the sham trial and her journey to the mountain settlement, watching his expression grow darker with each detail. Gregory Flores, Noah repeated when she mentioned her husband's former partner. That name sounds familiar. I think I may have heard it mentioned in town. He's probably expanded his operations since I've been gone, Evelyn said bitterly. Men like him always do. Noah was quiet for a moment, staring into the fire. When he spoke again, his voice carried a note of steel that she hadn't heard before. Men like him usually get what's coming to them eventually. The mountain has its own way of dealing with corruption. There was something ominous in his tone that made Evelyn wonder about his past and what had driven him to seek justice in such a remote place. She sensed that Noah Watson was not a man to be crossed, and that beneath his gentle manner lay a capacity for action that could be formidable when aroused. As the night grew later, Noah banked the fire and prepared to retire to his own room. Before he left, he turned to Evelyn with a serious expression. "You're safe here," he said simply. "Whatever happened before, whatever you're afraid might happen next, you're safe in this place. I give you my word." The sincerity in his voice made her believe him completely. For the first time in months, Evelyn felt the tight knot of fear in her chest begin to loosen. She was still uncertain about the future, still worried about her baby, and what would happen when the child was born. But for now, she was safe. The next few weeks passed in a peaceful routine that Evelyn had never expected to experience again. Each morning, she would wake to the sound of Noah moving quietly around the cabin, preparing breakfast and tending to the daily chores that kept their mountain home functioning. He was unfailingly courteous, always asking if she needed anything and giving her space to rest and recover from her ordeal. Gradually, Evelyn began to contribute to the household tasks. Despite Noah's protests that she should focus on regaining her strength, she found satisfaction in cooking meals, mending clothes, and organizing the cabin's interior. The domestic activities reminded her of happier times with Anthony, but they also helped her feel useful and valued, rather than simply being a burden on Noah's hospitality. Noah, for his part, seemed to appreciate her contributions without taking them for granted. He thanked her for every meal she prepared and every task she completed, treating her efforts with a respect that warmed her heart. She began to see glimpses of the man he had been before, whatever tragedy had driven him to the mountains. Moments of humor and gentleness that suggested a depth of character she found increasingly appealing. The baby continued to grow, and Evelyn's pregnancy progressed without complications. Noah had some knowledge of midwifery, learned during his sister's time with him, and he helped Evelyn prepare for the birth with a practical competence that eased many of her fears. He gathered supplies, prepared a birthing room, and even located an experienced midwife in a settlement 2 days right away who could be summoned when the time came. One evening, as they sat by the fire after dinner, Evelyn felt bold enough to ask Noah about his past. "You mentioned that you came here 5 years ago. What were you before you became a mountain man?" Noah was quiet for so long that she thought he might not answer. Finally, he spoke, his voice distant with memory. "I was a judge back in Colorado Territory. Had a practice, a house in town, a wife named Diane who was the most beautiful woman I'd ever seen." The past tense made Evelyn's heart ache for him. "What happened?" "Corruption," Noah said simply. "The same thing that destroyed your life, just in a different form. There were powerful men in the territory who wanted certain verdicts, certain sentences. When I refused to cooperate, they found ways to pressure me." He stared into the flames, his hands clenched in his lap. "They threatened Diane first, then they started spreading lies about my integrity, my competence. When that didn't work, they arranged for false evidence to be planted in my chambers. Evidence that would have destroyed my career and sent me to prison." "How did you escape?" "Diane found out about the plot from a friend whose husband was involved. She warned me just in time for us to flee, but we had to leave everything behind. We came to the mountains to start over, to build a new life away from all the corruption and lies." Evelyn waited, sensing that there was more to the story. Noah's expression had grown even more pained, and she could see the struggle in his eyes as he decided whether to continue. "We had been here about 6 months when a group of men tracked us down. They claimed to be federal marshals, but I recognized one of them as a hired gun from back in Colorado. They said they had come to arrest me on charges of embezzlement, but I knew they were really there to eliminate the threat I represented to their employers." "What did you do?" "I fought them. Noah said quietly. I had to. But in the gunfight, Diane was caught in the crossfire. She died in my arms, telling me that she loved me and that I had to keep fighting for what was right. The pain in his voice was so raw that Evelyn reached out instinctively and took his hand. His fingers closed around hers with desperate strength, as if her touch was an anchor in a sea of grief. I'm so sorry, she whispered. I'm so very sorry. Noah nodded, unable to speak for a moment. When he finally continued, his voice was steadier. After that, I became someone different. I hunted down the men who had killed her, one by one, and made sure they faced justice, even if it wasn't the kind dispensed in courtrooms. The implication of his words sent a chill through Evelyn, but she didn't pull her hand away. She understood now why Noah had been willing to pay such a high price for her freedom, why he couldn't walk away from injustice. He had seen what corruption could do to innocent people, had lost everything he loved to the greed and cruelty of powerful men. Is that why you helped me? She asked. Because you understood what I was going through? Partly, Noah admitted, but also because you reminded me of Diane, not in appearance but in spirit. She had the same strength you have, the same refusal to be completely broken no matter what was done to her. The comparison to his late wife should have made Evelyn uncomfortable, but instead she felt honored. From the way Noah spoke of Diane, it was clear that she had been an extraordinary woman, and to be compared to her was a compliment of the highest order. What happened to Laura? Evelyn asked gently. You mentioned that she died last winter. Noah's grip on her hand tightened slightly. She came here after her husband started beating her. He was a prominent businessman in Denver, well-connected and respected, so no one would believe her when she tried to get help. She finally ran away in the middle of the night and made her way here. She was brave to leave. She was, Noah agreed. But the journey through the mountains in winter was hard on her. She arrived half frozen and sick, and although she recovered her physical health, I think the trauma of her marriage and the difficulty of her escape weakened her constitution. When pneumonia struck last winter, she didn't have the strength to fight it off. Evelyn could hear the guilt in his voice, the self-recrimination of a man who blamed himself for not being able to save someone he loved. You did everything you could for her. Sometimes that's all we can do. I know that intellectually, Noah said, but knowing it and feeling it are different things. I keep thinking that if I had been a better brother, if I had gone to get her sooner, if I had taken better care of her health. You gave her safety and love when she needed it most, Evelyn interrupted. That's not nothing. That's everything. They sat in comfortable silence after that, still holding hands, watching the fire burn down to glowing coals. Evelyn felt a deep connection to this man who had suffered so much loss, who had chosen to isolate himself rather than risk being hurt again. She understood his pain because she had experienced her own version of it, and she recognized the courage it had taken for him to open his home and his heart to her. As the weeks passed, their relationship deepened from gratitude and mutual respect to something more complex and meaningful. They worked together easily, their different strengths complementing each other in the daily tasks of mountain living. Noah's practical skills and physical strength balanced Evelyn's organizational abilities and domestic talents, creating a partnership that felt natural and comfortable. The baby's movements became more pronounced as Evelyn entered her final month of pregnancy. Noah would sometimes place his hand on her belly when the child was particularly active, marveling at the life growing within her. His touch was always gentle and respectful, but Evelyn could see the wonder in his eyes, the awe of a man who had never expected to witness such a miracle. One morning, Evelyn woke to find Noah standing at the window with a troubled expression. When she asked what was wrong, he pointed toward the valley below where a group of riders was making its way up the mountain trail. Do you recognize them? Evelyn asked, though the distance made it impossible to make out individual faces. No, but they're riding hard and they're well armed. In my experience, that usually means trouble. Noah moved to a cabinet and withdrew a rifle, checking to make sure it was loaded. I want you to stay inside and away from the windows until we know what they want. Evelyn's heart began to race as the fear she had been living without for weeks came flooding back. Had Gregory somehow tracked her down? Were these men connected to the trafficking ring that had brought her to the mountains? The questions multiplied in her mind as she watched Noah prepare for what might be a confrontation. The riders reached the cabin within the hour, and Evelyn could hear their voices through the walls as they spoke with Noah on the porch. The conversation was tense but civil at first, with the strangers claiming to be looking for a woman who matched Evelyn's description. They said she was wanted for questioning in connection with a theft back in Millbrook, and they had reason to believe she might be in the area. Noah's response was calm but firm. He told them that he lived alone and hadn't seen any woman matching their description. When they asked to search the cabin, he refused, citing his rights as a property owner and suggesting that they would need a warrant to conduct any search. The leader of the group, a man with a harsh voice that made Evelyn's skin crawl, became more aggressive in his demands. He accused Noah of harboring a fugitive and threatened to return with federal marshals if he didn't cooperate. Noah's response was measured but carried an undertone of steel that Evelyn had heard before. "You're welcome to return with proper legal authority," Noah said. "Until then, you're trespassing on my land, and I suggest you move along before this conversation takes an unpleasant turn." The tension outside the cabin was palpable, and Evelyn pressed herself against the wall beside the window, trying to hear every word of the conversation. Her heart pounded as she recognized the voice of the group's leader. It was Benjamin Torres, one of Gregory's associates from Millbrook, a man known for his willingness to use violence to achieve his employer's goals. "We know she's here, Watson," Benjamin said, his voice carrying clearly through the thin mountain air. "We tracked her from the settlement where she was sold. Funny thing about that sale, though, the auctioneer remembers you paying a pretty high price for damaged goods. Makes a man wonder what you're really getting out of the deal." Noah's voice remained steady, but Evelyn could hear the danger beneath his calm tone. "I don't know what you're talking about, and I don't appreciate your implications. You have 30 seconds to get off my property before I start treating you as the threat you obviously are." "You don't understand who you're dealing with," Benjamin replied. "Gregory Flores has resources you can't imagine. He wants his property back, and he's willing to pay well for its return. We could make this worth your while if you're reasonable about it." "The only thing I understand is that you're trespassing," Noah said. "And if you think I'm impressed by Gregory Flores or his resources, you're badly mistaken. I've dealt with his kind before, and they all end up the same way." The threat in Noah's words was unmistakable, and Evelyn heard the sound of horses shifting restlessly as the riders processed his meaning. She knew that Benjamin was a dangerous man, but she was beginning to realize that Noah might be even more dangerous when provoked. The quiet mountain man had depths that she was only beginning to understand. "We'll be back," Benjamin said finally, "and next time we'll bring enough men to handle any resistance you might offer. Think about that while you are enjoying your temporary victory." "I'll be ready," Noah replied simply. Evelyn listened as the riders departed, their horses' hooves echoing off the mountain walls as they made their way back down the trail. When Noah entered the cabin, she saw that his expression had hardened into something cold and implacable. The gentleman who had cared for her so tenderly was gone, replaced by someone who looked capable of extreme violence. "They'll be back," he said without preamble, "and they'll bring more men next time. We need to be ready for them." "Maybe I should leave," Evelyn said, though the thought of facing Benjamin and his men alone terrified her. "I don't want to put you in danger because of my problems." Noah's expression softened slightly as he looked at her. "Running won't solve anything. These men won't stop pursuing you just because you're not here. If anything, leaving would put you in more danger than staying and fighting. But you could be hurt because of me. You could be killed." "I could be killed crossing the street in town," Noah replied. "Life doesn't come with guarantees, Evelyn. But I'll tell you this, I'd rather die fighting for something worthwhile than live as a coward who abandoned someone who needed help." His words reminded her of Anthony, who had also been willing to take a stand for what was right even when it put him in danger. The comparison was both comforting and terrifying because she knew how that story had ended. "What do we do?" she asked. "We prepare," Noah said grimly, "and we make sure that when they come back, they regret the decision." Over the next few days, Noah transformed their peaceful mountain home into a fortress. He reinforced the doors and windows, created defensive positions around the cabin, and laid in supplies of food, water, and ammunition. He also sent word to allies in the surrounding area, men who owed him favors, or who shared his distrust of corrupt authority. Evelyn helped as much as her condition allowed, but she could see the strain that the preparations were putting on Noah. He slept little and ate less, his attention constantly focused on potential threats and defensive strategies. She worried that the stress would wear him down before the confrontation even began. One evening, as they sat cleaning weapons by lamplight, Evelyn placed her hand on Noah's arm. "You don't have to do this," she said quietly. "I know you feel obligated because of what happened to Diane and Laura, but this isn't your fight." Noah looked up from the rifle he was examining, his gray eyes reflecting the lamp's flame. "Yes, it is," he said simply. "The moment I saw you on that auction block, it became my fight. The moment I paid that money and broke those chains, I made a choice about what kind of man I wanted to be." "And what kind of man is that?" "The kind who doesn't walk away when someone needs help. The kind who stands up to bullies and corrupt officials, even when it's dangerous. The kind who honors the memory of the people he's lost by protecting the people he still can." His words stirred something deep in Evelyn's chest, a feeling she hadn't experienced since Anthony's death. It wasn't just gratitude or friendship, but something deeper and more complex. She was falling in love with this complicated, damaged, honorable man, and the realization both thrilled and terrified her. The attack came 3 days later, just before dawn, when the mountain mist still clung to the valleys and visibility was limited. Noah had been expecting it, and he woke Evelyn at the first sound of approaching horses. They had rehearsed this moment, and she moved quickly to the secure room he had prepared for her in the back of the cabin while he took his position at the front windows. Benjamin Torres had brought 12 men this time, all armed and clearly prepared for a fight. They surrounded the cabin methodically, cutting off escape routes and taking positions that would allow them to pour concentrated fire into the building. It was the work of professionals, and Evelyn realized with growing horror that Gregory's reach was even longer than she had imagined. "Watson," Benjamin called out, "this is your last chance to be reasonable. Send out the woman and we'll leave you in peace. Keep protecting her and we'll burn you out and take her anyway." Noah's response was a rifle shot that knocked Benjamin's hat from his head, the bullet passing close enough to part his hair. The message was clear. There would be no negotiation, no compromise, no surrender. The gunfight that followed was intense but brief. Noah had chosen his defensive positions well, and his allies arrived at the crucial moment to catch Benjamin's men in a crossfire. The mountain men who came to Noah's aid were skilled fighters, accustomed to violence, and unimpressed by the hired guns from the cities below. Evelyn crouched in her hiding place, listening to the sounds of battle and praying that Noah would survive. The baby moved restlessly within her, as if sensing the danger that surrounded them. She whispered reassurances to her unborn child, promising that somehow they would get through this and find safety. When the shooting stopped, the silence was almost as frightening as the gunfire had been. Evelyn waited, hardly daring to breathe, until she heard Noah's voice calling her name. She emerged from her hiding place to find him wounded but alive. A bullet grazed on his arm, the only visible injury he had sustained. Benjamin Torres lay dead in the clearing in front of the cabin, along with 3 of his men. The rest had fled when they realized they were outgunned and outmaneuvered. Noah's allies were already searching the bodies and securing the area, their efficient movements suggesting this wasn't the first time they had dealt with such a situation. "It's over," Noah said, pulling Evelyn into his arms despite his wounded arm. "They won't be coming back." But even as he spoke the words, they both knew it wasn't really over. Gregory Flores was still alive, still powerful, still determined to reclaim what he considered his property. Benjamin's death would only make him more dangerous, more committed to revenge against both Evelyn and Noah. "We can't stay here," Evelyn said, voicing what they both knew to be true. "He'll send more men, better men. This place isn't safe anymore." Noah nodded reluctantly. "I know. But where can we go? Gregory's influence reaches throughout the territory, and you're in no condition to travel far." As if summoned by their conversation, Evelyn felt a sharp pain in her lower back, followed by a sensation she had been expecting, but hoping would wait a little longer. The stress of the attack had triggered her labor, and the baby was coming whether they were ready or not. "Noah," she gasped, gripping his uninjured arm. "The baby. It's time." The next few hours passed in a blur of pain and effort, with Noah serving as both protector and midwife. His allies stood guard outside while he helped Evelyn through the most difficult experience of her life. The irony wasn't lost on her that her child was being born in the aftermath of violence, surrounded by the bodies of men who had tried to drag her back into slavery. But when her daughter finally arrived, crying lustily and perfectly healthy, all thoughts of danger and pursuit faded into the background. Evelyn held her baby girl and wept with joy, overwhelmed by the miracle of new life in the midst of so much death and destruction. Noah looked down at the tiny infant with wonder, his battle-hardened expression softening into something approaching reverence. "She's beautiful," he whispered, gently stroking the baby's cheek with one finger. "What should we name her?" Evelyn asked, though she had been thinking about this question for months. "What about hope?" Noah suggested, because that's what she represents. Hope for the future, hope for something better. Evelyn smiled through her tears. "Hope Watson," she said, testing the sound of it. "I like that." The decision to give the baby Noah's surname was significant, representing more than just convenience or practicality. It was a declaration of their commitment to each other and to the future they would build together. In the eyes of the law, Evelyn was still technically Noah's property, purchased at that terrible auction. But between them, the reality was entirely different. As Evelyn recovered from the birth, Noah made arrangements for their departure from the mountain cabin that had been their sanctuary. His allies helped them prepare for the journey, providing supplies, weapons, and information about safe routes through the wilderness. The plan was to travel north into Canada, where Gregory's influence couldn't reach and where they could start fresh with new identities. The journey was difficult for a woman who had just given birth, but Evelyn endured it with the same strength that had carried her through all her previous trials. Baby Hope proved to be a good traveler, sleeping peacefully in the specially designed carrier that Noah had constructed for her. They moved slowly but steadily, following game trails and avoiding settlements where they might be recognized. During the long days of travel, Noah and Evelyn had time to talk about their future and what it might hold. They discussed practical matters like where they would settle and how they would support themselves, but they also talked about deeper things, their hopes for Hope's upbringing, their dreams of building a real home together, their growing love for each other. The transformation in their relationship was gradual but profound. What had begun as a rescue mission and evolved into mutual respect had become something deeper and more lasting. They were partners now in every sense of the word, united by shared danger and common purpose, but also by genuine affection and growing intimacy. One evening, as they camped beside a mountain stream with Hope sleeping peacefully between them, Noah took Evelyn's hand and looked into her eyes with an expression of complete sincerity. "I want you to know that whatever happens, however this ends, these past months with you have been the happiest I've known since Diane died. You and Hope have given me something I thought I'd lost forever." "What's that?" Evelyn asked, though she thought she already knew the answer. "A reason to believe in tomorrow," Noah replied. "A reason to think that maybe the future can be better than the past." Evelyn squeezed his hand, feeling tears prick her eyes. "You saved my life, Noah. Not just from that auction block, but from despair. You showed me that there are still good men in the world, still people worth trusting and loving." They were married by a traveling preacher they encountered near the Canadian border, a simple ceremony witnessed by Hope and the vast wilderness that surrounded them. It wasn't the wedding Evelyn had once dreamed of, but it was perfect in its own way, a union born of genuine love rather than social expectation or economic necessity. Their new life in Canada was challenging but rewarding. They settled in a small farming community where Noah's skills as a carpenter and Evelyn's abilities as a seamstress were in demand. They built a modest home on the outskirts of town, far enough from their neighbors to maintain privacy but close enough to be part of the community. Hope grew into a bright, curious child who inherited her mother's intelligence and her father's quiet strength. She never knew the circumstances of her birth or the danger that had surrounded her earliest days. To her, Noah was simply her father, the man who taught her to ride and hunt and think for herself. Years passed peacefully, with no word from Gregory Flores or his associates. Evelyn sometimes wondered if he had given up the pursuit or if something had happened to him. but she tried not to dwell on the past. The life she had built with Noah was too precious to be overshadowed by old fears and resentments. One day when Hope was 5 years old, a letter arrived that would change everything. It was from an attorney in Denver, informing them that Gregory Flores had been killed in a mining accident and that his estate was being settled. More importantly, evidence had been found among his papers that proved Anthony Scott's innocence and Evelyn's rightful claim to the property that had been stolen from her. The letter offered them the chance to return to Colorado and reclaim what had been taken, to clear Anthony's name and restore Evelyn's reputation. It was everything she had once dreamed of, complete vindication and the return of her former life. But as she read the letter to Noah, Evelyn realized that she no longer wanted her former life back. The woman who had been auctioned in chains no longer existed. In her place was someone stronger, someone who had found love and purpose in the most unlikely circumstances. Someone who had learned that home wasn't a place, but the people you chose to share your life with. "What do you want to do?" Noah asked her, though his expression suggested he already knew her answer. "I want to stay here," Evelyn said without hesitation. "This is our home now. This is where we belong." Noah smiled, the expression transforming his weathered face and reminding her of the first moment she had seen kindness in his eyes. "I was hoping you'd say that." They burned the letter that night, watching the flames consume the last link to their troubled past. As the fire died down to glowing embers, Noah wrapped his arms around Evelyn and Hope, holding his family close under the vast Canadian sky. The chains that had once bound Evelyn had been broken long ago, but it was only now that she truly understood what freedom meant. It wasn't just the absence of physical restraint, but the presence of choice. The ability to decide for herself what kind of life she wanted to live and who she wanted to share it with. In the distance, a wolf howled, its voice echoing off the mountains that surrounded their valley. It was a wild sound, untamed and free, and it seemed to Evelyn like a song of celebration, a recognition of the journey that had brought her from despair to joy, from slavery to freedom, from loneliness to love. She had walked free with Noah Watson that day at the auction, but it had taken years for her to understand that freedom was not something that could be given or taken away by others. It was something that came from within, from the courage to choose hope over fear, love over hatred, and the future over the past. As they prepared for bed, Hope sleeping peacefully in her father's arms, Evelyn looked back one more time at the ashes of the letter that could have changed everything. She felt no regret, no sense of loss for the life she might have reclaimed. The woman who had been auctioned in chains was gone, replaced by someone who had learned that the most valuable things in life could not be bought or sold, only freely given and gratefully received. The mountain man had indeed broken her chains, but more than that, he had shown her how to break the invisible bonds of fear and despair that had held her captive long after the physical shackles had fallen away. Together, they had built something beautiful from the ashes of their separate tragedies, proving that sometimes the most unlikely circumstances can lead to the most extraordinary love stories. In the quiet of the Canadian wilderness, surrounded by the families she had chosen and who had chosen her in return, Evelyn Roberts Watson finally understood what it meant to be truly free.